With that, I'd like to invite the next panel up. Both Paige and Candace earlier on, as well as Director Rose, referred to the unique trauma that older victims suffer when they're abused or victimized by fraud. And so our next panel will help us get a better understanding of that trauma and how that should inform how we interface with older victims who have been victimized, as well as what we can do better in terms of connecting them to available resources. So with that, I will turn the mic over to Justin.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good afternoon. My name is Justin Ramsdahl. I'm an associate professor of psychology at George Mason University. For those of you who don't know, Mason's a large research university in Virginia. Nobody knows about us because we don't have a football team. But we have 600 acres and 40,000 students, and it's an amazing school. And I teach forensic psych there and mostly do research in police CIT teams and crisis de-escalation, as well as train local law enforcement. And I'll let Chris introduce himself.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Merkel. I've been in law enforcement for 28 years, and 3 years ago, I switched from being a detective at a police department in Longmont, Colorado, to working for the 20th Judicial District as a senior investigator there. But I started working elder abuse crimes probably about 14 or 15 years ago, and we'll kind of get into how that transition happened because it kind of has to do with some of the resources that kind of got me into this field. And today we're going to talk about trauma and how it kind of affects your interviews. Justin is going to kind of give the academic part of it, and I'm going to chip in every once in a while with a case example of interviews that I've done where I saw kind of what he's talking about. And yes, they have names, but they're not their real names. Obviously, we want to keep that anonymous, but they're real stories and they have, real outcomes. And it's just, I think it's really important. And I'm so glad that Andy and Shelley asked us to come out and talk about this. I've never presented with Justin, but I've gotten to kind of know him a little well. And I hope that you get a lot out of this.
Okay, so I was talking to some people beforehand. It always drives me crazy when there's more than 10 words on a PowerPoint slide. So I will not read, you can read, I will not read those to you, and I will not bore you with that, but this is what we're attempting to do today. Right now, what we're talking about is recognizing trauma in older adults, but in order to do that, we've got to kind of rewind things a little bit, right? And we've got to figure out how we're recognizing trauma in everyone, and then talk about what's unique, what's different with recognizing trauma in older adults. Right? So let's start with everybody. First of all, recognition of trauma is really difficult because it's not a single emotion, right? It's a soup of emotions and experiences. Recognizing surprise is easy. Everyone knows what surprise looks like. Your eyebrows go up, your jaw drops to the floor, right? Anger is easy. You get the eyebrows that come in and the face, right? Trauma is not like that. Right? And when you are trying to recognize trauma, you're looking at change from baseline. It is probably the most useful piece of information for any psychologist, doctor, clinician, right? Like, what were you like before? What are you like now? However, right, I work in forensics. I used to be a psychologist in a jail and a maximum security mental hospital. I know what you all do for a living. In both of our scenarios, you don't have baseline. You're just getting this person for the first time, right? So there's no A, all you've got is B. And so you don't know if there's been a change, and that's very difficult in situations you find yourself. You find yourself in situations that I find myself in. And then you're going to, as a clinician, I'm going to look for presence of PTSD symptoms, right? Now, it took me a long time to learn all this information. I had to go get a doctoral degree and then actually practice and become good at applying these criteria. And we certainly don't expect law enforcement or anybody else to do that in the field with any regularity, without practice, right? That's not your job. And so it's hard, right? It's really difficult. Now, easiest sign is somebody just telling you. It's always the easiest thing, right? It's somebody saying, this is what happened. Now, we are with a generation of Americans now who are younger, who talk about mental health way more openly than my generation did, and probably your generation, if you're from a different one, right? And that's great. I'm all for it. Right? I think it's fantastic. However, when people use mental health terms in popular culture, they have a tendency of getting diluted, right? And I've heard my daughter say things like, "Oh my God, that was so traumatic," and I was like, That was unfortunate. There's a difference, right? Nobody almost died. Nobody was sexually assaulted. They didn't have the smoothie flavor you wanted. Right? That's not it. Right? And so when people say like, oh, this is very traumatic, like if they tell you and it meets the criteria for trauma, then like that's great. But sometimes you just have to be aware that modern language is a little different. And in general, most people don't like to talk about mental illness. Most people don't like to ask about mental illness. When I was training second year, when I first started seeing patients, they said I was in a jail and they're like, you have to ask everybody whether they're suicidal. And like, I just remember the first couple people I was talking to where I was just kind of like, my boss is making me do this, but are you going to kill yourself? I'm sorry, I have to ask. Right. And I just felt like really weird talking about it. And I feel weird asking about it. People feel weird talking about it. And that's totally normal. Right. There's lots of mental health issues by stats. There's like people in this room, like just statistically, someone in here is hallucinating. But if I ask you to raise your hand, you're not going to do it. Right. Because there's a stigma associated with mental illness, and there's a stigma associated with sharing that information and appearing weak. Nobody wants to be like that, right? So this is really hard, right? Now, there are some aspects that are common to all people, right? But to talk about these, we need to kind of talk about your brain, right? Now, I'm going to make this super simple. I'm going to try and make it quick because, like, just to put it all in perspective, your brain is what, roughly 80 billion neurons. It's 3 pounds of protein and fat that floats between your ears, runs on electricity, and is somehow responsible for all of your hopes, dreams, fears, movement, and emotions, right? It's complicated. And to explain that quickly is not an easy thing to do, but we want to focus on one particular part of it today, which is your HPA axis, which you probably know is your fight or flight response, or fight, flight, or freeze response. And that involves 3 things. 1, your hypothalamus. All you need to know, it does lots of things. For us, Grand Central Station. Your brain communicates with neurotransmitters, GABA, serotonin, right? Your rest of your body does not communicate in that language. So your brain speaks Portuguese and the rest of your body speaks Chinese, and they need a translator because they don't speak the same language, right? So because all of most of the thoughts in your brain and impulses go through the hypothalamus in some way, it translates. It translates that to the pituitary gland, which you probably remember from junior high. Boys and girls go through changes, right? And which is true, but why we're interested in it is because it's the gland that communicates with the rest of the glands in your body, in your endocrine system, right? So it gets the message translated, and then it can send the message out in the right language to the rest of the glands. One of the glands it sends them to is the adrenal gland, which I'm sure you've heard of before, and releases adrenaline. We're going to talk about that in a second. Those 3 things together, if I'm walking, right, and all of a sudden I'm staring at my phone, whatever, I'm not paying attention, right? And then I look up and there's a bear, like in DC, right? Like then this is going to happen in 1/100th of a second, right? Like I'm going to recognize it as a bear. My brain's going to go like, oh my God. And then all this happens. And then you get that rush of hormones. And it's that rush of hormones that we want to talk about. The 3 biggest ones that are part of that cascade that happens right away, right? Adrenaline, endogenous opioids, not something you got from the outside. Your body has its own, can make its own, right? And cortisol. Now, all 3 of those do different things. Right? Everybody kind of remembers adrenaline, right? Again, from like health class, like sends all the blood to your legs and your arms so that you can run or that you can fight, increases oxygen, increases your heart rate, like all sorts of good things happen. And we've evolved to need that, right? Opioids obviously decrease pain, like, and I don't need to explain that to you, right? And then cortisol increases the available amount of glucose. Your body's got sugars that it kind of keeps around for emergency situations. And when this happens, it's like, right, release all the fuel, and all the fuel goes. So those 3 chemicals happen at the same time. The issue here, right, is that every action has a side effect. Like that's how medications work. Every solution causes some problem, right? And hopefully the problems your solution causes aren't as bad, right? Now, all of those chemicals are super useful in an emergency, but they may not be useful at other times, right? So for example, adrenaline, while it does increase your physical performance, one of the places that the blood gets diverted from is your frontal lobe. And you may recognize your frontal lobe. If I say that and it like rings a bell for you, right? Your frontal lobe is in the front, right? We're not going to dumb it that far down. But it's where you do your executive functioning and your thinking, right? Think of your frontal lobe this way. It's like the manager for like all of the other stuff in your brain. All the other stuff is naming stuff. It's identifying stuff. It's seeing stuff. It's processing bodily sensations. And your frontal lobe's doing the thinking, right? So if I wanted to engage your frontal lobe, I would pick one of you at random and be like, okay, at 5:30 today, we're having a luau in this room. You're in charge. Here's $1,000. Make it happen, right? And you'd be like, okay. Like, are we going to have food? Are we going to have drinks? I got to get decorations. I've got to get plates and napkins. I'm not even from this city. I got to figure out where all the stores are. I got to figure out how I'm going to get there, how I'm going to get all this stuff back, how it's all going to fit in the budget. That's executive functioning, right? Planning an emergency luau. Okay? But if I divert blood away from the frontal lobe and you're not doing that kind of thinking, okay, then what's going to happen in an emergency is you might do some stuff that doesn't make sense, because you're just not thinking. It's not that you're not thinking, it's that you're literally not able to think at the same level, because we just lowered the available amount of oxygen that we sent to the thing that's responsible for thinking, because we sent it to your arms, we sent it to your legs, we sent it to your heart, right? And so how many times can you think where a victim has been recounting a story and there's been an officer who's like, no, nobody acts like that. Right? There's no way what you're saying is true, because people don't act like that. And the problem is, like, you're thinking about it like in a comfortable chair. And this whole system isn't engaged. You've got all the blood to your frontal lobe. But emergencies and traumas don't happen when you plan them. They don't happen when you want. You're caught off guard. This whole system kicks in and you may do something that's weird because you're not thinking about it. But people get hammered over and over again about this point later, like, well, they wouldn't have acted like that, right? If what they're saying is true. And they're like, well, actually, if you weren't thinking, you do a lot of weird stuff. Right? Now, all this stuff applies to everyone, right? But there are some parts that apply to elderly individuals a little bit more frequently or more specifically. I always have trouble with that one. That one in particularly, I always have to say, I feel like I sound like I've been drinking every time I say it. All right, so let's get back to this HPA axis. So we've got the adrenaline. It's going to divert blood from the frontal lobe. You may do stuff that doesn't make sense in the moment and immediately after, right? It's not like if I step off the sidewalk and I hear tires screeching toward me in a car horn, and then this whole system kicks into gear, because that's what it does. It's not like I take one step back onto the curb and I'm like, okay, and then I'm fine. Right? Like, these chemicals hang around for a while. They're going to be there for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, depending on it, right? They can be there for a long time. It's long-term abuse. The opioids decrease pain, but I don't need to explain to law enforcement here, like, what someone who's hooked on fentanyl looks like when they're out on the street. Right? The side effect is that you're flat, emotionally flat. In fact, there's a ton of fascinating research about how the physical experience of pain takes place in one part of the brain, and then like the actual experience is in a totally different part of the brain, right? And so opioids do a great job of like deadening not only the like physical experience, the intensity, the location of pain, but they do an amazing job with emotional pain, because like social emotional pain, the brain processes almost the same as physical pain. So like shame, rejection, social isolation. There's a reason why if you look at the map of the United States and you look at opiate deaths, they're highest in the places that have the most social isolation, right? Because the drug works for that, and because it numbs emotion. And so those people, when you take those drugs, you look flat, right? And so there's no emotion showing on the person's face, because, I mean, this isn't going to be like a fentanyl dose of opioids, because your body isn't going to do that. It can't do that. But the mood is going to be impacted, right? And so I like the day of the event or the time of the event, for the first couple hours, they might be, right, just nothing, totally flat, right? But in older individuals, this can go on, right? And part of it is older individuals have just had a lot more stuff happen. I have a 93-year-old neighbor who's amazing. And when we were talking, we'd check on her during the pandemic. And when we talked to her and during the pandemic, she's like, whatever. She just was like, I've already been through all this stuff. She's like, we'll be fine. We'll get through it. Right. The country's been through all this stuff before. And so there are like actual practical reasons why maybe an elderly individual will be less emotional about that stuff. But then on top of that, that gets amplified by the opioids. Right. And so it can be months, it can be weeks. Right. And so let me turn it over to Chris, who can give you an example of what this looks like in practice.
So I'm going to try this podium out. I've got a little hitch in my giddy up. I got a bad ankle, got more hardware in there. For the first time after she was sexually assaulted by another resident at the assisted living center that she was at. I got to know Betty quite a bit through her family. I didn't learn a lot about, sorry, drop something. Did not learn a lot about Betty the night of the sexual assault. I learned more about Betty through her family, but then everything kind of came to mesh together as I spoke to her. To start off with, Betty, being 89, has all of her children are adult children at this point. And they would describe to me that Betty was a very religious woman, and that she brought all her children up in a very religious background, very strict rules, etc. Things that you did talk about, things that you don't talk about, were a part of her, bringing her children up. Let me tell you a little bit about Betty's assault. Betty lived in this facility, like I said, and she had a friend in the facility that was very much liked by all the staff. They really adored this male that was later to be the defendant in this case. And they were playing cards one night, and the staff would say that they were kind of flirtatious or whatever. But it was more in the way they talked to each other while they were playing cards. It had nothing to do with any kind of physical activity or anything like that. After the card night, people went to their individual rooms, and Betty went to her room, and the suspect followed her to her room. The suspect, neither of them were ambulatory, and the suspect literally followed her into the room, pulled her out of her wheelchair onto the floor, and began to sexually assault her. The staff heard some noise in the room, went to the room, saw this occurring, basically interrupted the act, and sent him back to his room and began to talk to her. It was very evident that something had happened, but they didn't know like the full context of what had actually happened. And so, like any sexual assault, the police were called, police responded, and she elected to do a SANE interview. One of the things that I found very interesting after learning about Betty and learning about how she had such, she was very personal, very, didn't talk about certain things, kind of that generation. And Betty had her daughter go to the hospital with her for her SANE exam. And after the SANE exam, her daughter told me, because she was interviewed by obviously the sexual nurse examiner, but also by law enforcement that night. And the way she presented was almost exactly opposite of her normal personality. She was very flat in affect. The way she narrated what happened to her that night was almost as if she was almost efficient in her facts. She wouldn't go off this way or that way. She was just dead center talking about what happened. Very succinct, very accurate, and very flat in her affect. One of the things that that the daughter noticed right away was that mom, Betty, was using terms that she never would have used before. And she was just telling the story. She was not only about her own personal body, but also about what the suspect had told her he wanted to do with those parts of her body. And he was using the words that the suspect used that were very not kind of the subject matter of a religious person would say. What was interesting is as we got closer and closer to trial with Betty, she moved on to a different assisted living, obviously, and she was in a whole different place. And I had the chance to go back and re-interview her prior to trial. While we interviewed her, it was around the holiday season and we were just checking in on her. What we were also trying to do is get a assessment of how her, what her capacity would be. How would she going to be a good witness on the stand? Would she be able to talk about these things? Would she be effective on the stand? Because she did have a little bit of dementia, but like we've learned earlier this morning, that doesn't mean somebody's going to be a good or a bad witness. That just means that's something that we need to be aware of and we need to probably prepare for. As we spoke to Betty, we transitioned from the holidays to family stuff to how do you feel about this upcoming trial that we're planning for? And it was amazing that her mood changed again from the talking about the trial or talking about family, talking about the new place she was living at, and transitioned back to the assault. And again, she was very matter of fact, very unbelievably able to recount things. In fact, one of the things I remember the most in that meeting, this is like 3 months before trial and a year after the assault had happened, is she told me, and the prosecutor that was meeting with her, that it's been a year and it still hurts when I go to the bathroom. And I was like, this is as good of evidence from a witness as we're going to get, especially with somebody who's been through so many different things in her life. When Justin and I were talking about these things, so we're going to kind of go back and forth to different examples. That one hit me immediately as someone who was just going down a straight and narrow road and just telling of what happened without being the normal personality that they were.
Right. And I think when you're talking, like one of the first slides was change from baseline. I think family, friends can be a good barometer of that if they're around, where like you're talking to someone, you can be like, and you look over and they're like, that's not normal, right? Or they might be like, no, that's exactly how they are all the time, right? It might be different. But so all right, so we've got adrenaline, we've got opioids. Let's go to cortisol, one of the lesser known, right? Like, okay, we're not going to get too far into the brain stuff, but cortisol, it has a use in terms of releasing those energy reserves in an emergency, right? But it negatively affects hippocampal functioning, right? So your hippocampus is like kind of buried there in your brain. And the role of your hippocampus, that's actually what it's shaped like. I had a guy draw it for me, right? They're all structurally accurate. They just happen to be cartoons. But like when you go to sleep tonight, right, your hippocampus is going to go through all the stuff that happened today and be like, okay, this is important, let's file that away. But there's all sorts of information, like what the person next to you is wearing, how cold or hot the room was, the sounds that are in here while we're talking, what the stairs are made out of. It's like, no, throw that away, don't need that. Yeah, this is good, keep that, right? So think of it as like a file clerk, takes things from short-term memory, puts them in long-term memory, right? The problem with this is that cortisol negatively impacts how your hippocampus functions. In fact, in cases of like long-term abuse, like with kids, their hippocampus is physically smaller. Like a kid who is in a long-term abuse scenario at home, they're in this mode all the time and there's always cortisol. That kid can study all they want and put all the effort they want into learning something for school and taking a test and then go in and fail because they literally can't remember. Like they literally are not able to learn, which then just like starts this whole spiral, right? But this is also true of adults. So think about memory and traumatic events like this, right? Like, so I take away all your computers, tablets, phones, right? You get nothing but a pen and one of those like 2 stacks of those little, not even the regular Post-it notes, like the little ones, right? So I give you like a couple stacks of those. And I'm like, okay, all day today, you get to take notes on these. But at the end of the day, I'm going to test you on this. Right? And like whatever. And whether or not your agency at home is going to pay for your airfare here or reimburse you is going to depend on whether or not you pass this test. Right? So you got something on the line. Now, like we go through the whole day, you're writing real tiny, both sides. You've got a little file system you've created, sticking them in order somewhere or whatever it might be, a little pile of Post-it notes. And then I go through and I hand out the test. And then right before I hand out the test, I take all of your Post-it notes and I just chuck them in the air all over. And now I'm like, go, you've got 3 minutes to take the test. Like right after they're still falling around you. That's what cortisol will do to the hippocampus. You will hear victims give the story, right? And it's not that the information's not there. It's like when all these chemicals are floating around, and even sometimes weeks after, like they just can't find the note. They're like, no, I took good notes. I listened, like I have all the information. If you just give me 10 minutes, I could get all these in order and I could pass your test. And I'll be like, no, you don't have to. You have to answer the questions now. And so instead they start picking up notes. But when you pick up the notes, you pick up the notes in random order. They're not like in your system. They're not sequential. You're like, then this happened. Oh, and then this thing over here. Oh, and then here's the next something I remember from the middle, right? And the story doesn't sound like a story. The story sounds disjointed. And then the next day, when these chemicals start settling down, right? And you can start remembering more. They'll say like, oh yeah, and I remember this. And oh yeah, I remember this. And to a lot of investigators, it sounds like trauma victims are just making stuff up. Right? Like this is the kind of thing that someone does when they're making up a story. Like, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about this, which is funny because that's not how people lie. When people who lie have a story. People who lie don't spontaneously correct their statements because like they know they rehearse what they want to say, right? And so this is true of everyone, regardless of age. Right? But research has shown this trend can continue longer in older adults. So with that, here's another example from Chris about like this type of thing happening.
So then the next person we're going to talk about is Ella, and she's actually one of my favorite people to talk about. And quite frankly, this is going to circle around once we're done talking about Ella as far as the case example. I'm going to bring Ella back up when we talk about resources and connecting with victims. I met Ella. I wasn't even in the detective bureau yet. I was a patrol officer. I worked the west side of my city, and there was a lot of assisted living facilities there and other places, but this was a big apartment complex that I kept on getting calls to, and it was husband and wife, Ella and her husband had Lewy body dementia, and her husband would call 911 and then hang up. And of course, we would drive over. The first time I ever went over there, of course, my alerts way up and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I've never met Ella or her husband, and I get over there and talking to them. And luckily that day, Ella was home. And Ella, I immediately noticed Ella spoke a very thick accent. She was from Germany. And as I'm inside the house, I can see all kinds of military plaques and emblems on the wall and the flag and medals everywhere. And I learned right away through Ella and through her husband that her husband was a service member and he served in World War II. And now he had dementia pretty bad, and he would do things. He would sometimes get lost, but what we learned later is he would call 911 almost on a weekly basis and then hang up, and we would go over there. And I got to know Ella through that, just through those engagements right there. There wasn't anything else going on. There wasn't anything really criminal at all, except just the 911 call and us trying to figure out what was really going on. Fast forward about probably about 2 years after I meet Ella, and I've talked to her on these calls. Sometimes she's not there, sometimes he's home alone and this happens, but I'd probably have been over there close to a dozen times in a matter of 2 years. And so you get kind of used to where you're going and kind of the scenario, and try not to take it, try to still do your job and make sure nothing's going on, but it's always kind of the same thing. I'm on day shift and I get a call on the beat. I immediately recognize the address and it's on an unattended death. And so I respond over there and it's Ella's husband. He's finally succumbed to his health issues, his dementia issues, and he's passed away in the middle of the night. And I talked to Ella, and Ella is a complete, so Ella, one of the things you need to know about her is in all my engagements prior to this, she answers questions when it's crucial and when she is comfortable, or when I ask her, directly, but she's not an extrovert. She's not like me. She's only when information is necessary to be given, she'll give it. And she's not withholding anything, but she's not comfortable, you can tell. And we're going to talk about that again here when we get to the resources. So I talked to Ella. I get the story on what happened that night, what happened, when's like what we do. What time did you go to bed? How was he feeling before you went to bed? And we're having this discussion. And Ella is not at all like my previous engagements of talking to her. She is all over the place. And what I learned, and I was kind of putting it together in my head over the years of going to that house, is Ella lived in Germany. He was a serviceman there. After the war, they got married and they came back to the US. But Ella has an entire baggage of sticky notes of trauma from the war and from the trauma from the death now, and some other trauma from some other things that happened in her life that now have, like Justin has said, have been scattered all over the table. And she's trying to tell me what's going on. And so she's answering my questions, but then she's interjecting other information, which she never used to do, about the war and about coming back to America and not knowing anyone and not being comfortable here and raising a family and being here for 40, 50 years and still not being comfortable here and going back and forth from one trauma piece to the next trauma piece to the next trauma piece. It was really interesting. We got the information we needed, but it was interesting. But Ella's story has a really happy conclusion, and we're going to talk about that when we go back to resources.
Sorry. Okay. Now, we said some are more specific to older adults. Now, this is getting in the weeds a little bit in terms of research. These things are true, but it can be difficult to notice this until you think about an interaction with someone afterward. Older individuals who experience trauma, either prior trauma or trauma that that day or that week, they use grammatical tense changes far more often than younger people, right? Which is, I want you to think about this. If I ask you to tell me a story, say one day I went to the store to buy groceries and I saw an officer standing by his car. I saw a man with a knife attack the officer. Soon after the officers arrived, they pushed me backward. Everything is past tense. You're telling the story and it's just, right? That's how, if you were going to write it and your teacher was going to grade it, right? That's how you would want to write it. But for reasons that if you're going to ask me this question, I can't answer it, right? For reasons I can't answer, but we know it happens. Older individuals tend to, when they're telling stories about trauma specifically, tend to change the tense within the sentence. So instead of being like before, it'll say, one day I went to the store and I see officers standing by his car. I see a man with a knife. The officers are arriving. And then they might switch back and say and they were pushing me back or whatever. And it's not something that's easy to pin down, but it was one of those things where, and I was like, all right, and I got to do this. Let me go back and look at some more research. And I came across that and I thought it was fascinating, but doing this in real time, no. If you have a recording of an interview that you can listen back to, that might be useful. But I'll let Chris describe a case where you felt like something like this was happening.
So another assisted living case. I know that the statistics say that 3 to 4% of elder abuse crimes occur in an assisted living or type of facility type environment. I have quite a few cases that I have from facilities, and I think sometimes I totally believe that statistic, by the way, because more people live within their homes. But part of my reason for belief that we get a lot of them from the facilities is because they're number one, there's a lot more witnesses, there's a lot more suspects, there's just all the pools come together, and we seem to still get those quite frequently. This is another sexual assault. Involves a victim named Maria. Maria was monolingual Spanish. I was asked to go there and help interview her on a sexual assault that happened to her at the facility. And I've actually had this one happen before too, and I've seen it happen in a child advocacy center where a child was being interviewed in a very similar way. Maria recounted some of the incidences as well. So Maria is telling me about what happened, and the other officer that's with me. And Maria is telling me that it was her caregiver that sexually assaulted her, and that she never saw any signs of him doing anything, inappropriate with her. So she's talking in the past tense. I never saw, any signs. One time he did come up to me and put his hand on my shoulder and started to give me a neck rub. And I thought that was weird, is what she said. And then she starts to describe the actual assault as it happened. And what she said was very similar to what I've heard in a CAC when a child is being interviewed and they're asking a lot of the what did you hear? What did you see? But without prompting the questions like that, Maria starts telling me, I can hear the television on, and I can hear that it's, Family Feud or whatever she said is on the TV. I can hear birds chirping outside. He comes in, and now he is touching me, and everything switched from a past tense to the present tense. And it's almost like how I envisioned it as she was telling me, and how this happened before in this example, is it's almost as if the victim is suspended over the top of the scene and watching the act happen to them, and they're narrating it to you. That's the best way I can describe it. But it's happened a couple times to me, and Maria was a classic example of that. But it is hard to track, especially if it's not, I speak Spanish, but English is my first language. And so all of a sudden I'm like, am I hearing these tenses wrong? Am I the one that's screwing this up? And no, she was literally changing it to a present tense type of a situation.
And this tracks because one of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD is like feeling as though the event is happening again. And that's not present in all people who are diagnosed with PTSD, but it's absolutely one of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Right? Now the other one, and I felt weird bringing this one to Chris. I felt bad about doing it because a lot of times, especially older individuals, have difficulty explaining how the event has affected their relationship, right, with the people around them. And right, like it might be a generational thing. Like I said, the young kids are like, oh yeah, well then I felt depressed, or then I didn't, or then me and my friend weren't friends anymore because like it just didn't work out, or I was too annoying to them because of all these things that I was doing. And they talk about that more openly, right? But it feels like woe is me, right? And I don't want I don't want you to think that's what I'm saying, is that older individuals do that. What this is an individual who is not as in touch with their own emotional internal experience as someone else, and is having a hard time communicating it, right? Like my father's generation was like, rub some dirt on it and move on, right? And they had no idea what ADHD was, and now those are just the kids that like got sent out in the hallway to count the ceiling tiles, or they made them go run on the cross country team because they were too crazy, right? And then generations change, and then people talk about mental health ideas differently. And so sometimes, at least at this point in history, when you're dealing with older individuals, why you think they might have more ability to identify those emotions, especially men, it's a generation that was not taught to like talk about it. And if you're not taught to talk about it, then you're not taught to identify it accurately and even be able to communicate it. And so when they're trying to communicate symptoms, it comes across as like, oh my gosh, this is so like, woe is me.
I find this one, I don't have a specific name for this one because I've seen it quite often, and it kind of gets Like if you compare it to Betty, our first example, where she is just straight and narrow down the line, telling us exactly, succinctly, very efficiently of what happened, or even Ella, who brings in other trauma into the story, but is telling us. What I found with this one, I have an incredibly hard time tracking it because it's one of those where I almost feel like this person is in the pit of despair right now. They are in the worst place, and you're trying to talk to them about what's happening, and it's not working right now. And I think this is the time when you, as an investigator, especially if you're doing it right and you're bringing all the people that are going to need to hear this person's story, to regroup and come back another day when they can. And maybe it's still going to be this way. Maybe it's still going to be, I've never had, never had good luck in my life, or I've never had, I've heard this before where they dwell on things that are not pertinent to the actual case of, or the assault or the neglect or the financial exploitation that has happened to them. They go down this sidetrack of bad things that have happened to them, and they're just kind of telling you all about it, and it's hard to be productive in that interview. And so my suggestion with that, and what I've done in the past, is number one, do something that we cops, and I'm taking it, I'm a cop still too, but we cops don't do very well, and that's just listen. Just pause and listen and let them get a lot of that out, and then try to regroup and retract back to what you're there for and see how that works. If it doesn't work, then maybe start working on some resources, because maybe this person needs to talk to somebody that can help them way better than you can, and then you can come back and do a better job of interviewing them on whatever you're there for.
Right. And I would say that, like, I'm trained as a therapist. I'm not a therapist. I shouldn't be anybody's therapist, but to get a doctoral degree, I just learned how to do it. And this is not substantiated by research. This is just personal opinion. Like 75% of therapy is just naming the emotion for the person. Like when they're talking to you and they're like, and then this, and be like, okay, so you're scared that you might lose this thing. And they're like, yes, that's it. Right. And a lot of times when you're getting stories that don't feel like they're relevant to the questions that you're asking, what they're trying to communicate to you is like an emotional state, like this made me feel like that thing. Right. But they just don't have the ability to say it. And sometimes finding words to put to that. And I'm not saying go play therapist to be a therapist, but fear, anger, or anxiety. Just keep those three in your pocket. 75% of the time, one of those will stick. Because that's a lot of human experience, especially after something like this. Right. Oh, we already did that, didn't we? Yeah. Okay. So other things to consider, just some other random bits of information. Studies with military vets show that PTSD symptoms can arise later. And the average for PTSD symptoms showing up is 17 years after a war-related event, which took me by surprise. Like some people come home and like having trouble right away, but the average is 17 years after. So if you're like, but nothing's happened, right? Like the war was 20 years ago, that is totally in line with when you will see symptoms in cases with military vets. So it might appear to family and friends like this has come out of nowhere, but it absolutely has not, right? On average, older individuals exhibit lower symptoms, like lower levels of PTSD symptoms. So it's actually harder to spot. Like if we were trying to quantify the number and the severity of PTSD symptoms, as people age, the number and severity go down. Like it's not as severe in older people, which can make it harder to pick up on, especially as other presenters have talked about, like in the midst of other somatic issues, memory issues, everything else. And then the last one, although there's a lower level of severity with PTSD in older individuals, they do have higher levels of avoidance symptoms. So avoidance are like avoiding distressing thoughts, right? Avoiding anything that makes you think about whatever it was that happened, right? That happens far more frequently And you might check both of those criteria instead of just one, although only one's needed for diagnosis. And I should say one thing about diagnosis I think is important. The duration criteria is a month. If somebody gets their arm ripped off in a piece of industrial machinery or something like that, like I'm going to expect you to have some trouble. Right? Like I'd be worried if like 2 days later you're like, yeah, I'm okay, sleeping great. What? Right? Like, so just because something happens does not mean someone was traumatized, does not mean they have PTSD. If you get robbed, if your house sets on fire and you spend 3 weeks thinking, like falling asleep, thinking about the fact that you lost your house and there was a fire, that's normal. That's how it's supposed to be. Like if your dog dies, I expect you to call me and be like, hey, I can't come into work. Right? And be like, yeah, take a day or two. Sorry about your dog. Like that's normal. Right? I get nervous if you didn't get sad when your dog died. And so things that happen directly after are not PTSD. That's just normal. So you're going to need time to adjust. You can check off all the boxes, but unless it's been a month since the event, it's not PTSD. It's just like normal because that's what we would expect when something severe like that happens. And so don't start jumping into things and be like, oh, well, that was traumatic. Because the truth of the matter is the vast majority of people don't get PTSD symptoms after events that would be considered traumatic. They have a little trouble and then they wind up largely being okay. Right? And so I'll let Chris talk, but this is his area, not mine.
So I said we were going to circle back on some of these, and let's talk about resources. So you have this victim that's like a Betty or like a Ella, or you've got your job to do and you've got this criminal investigation that you have got to put together and make it rock solid so that we can hold that offender accountable. And there's a huge need for you to not just do that job by yourself. And we've talked about this a lot. I think every module that we've heard this morning talked a little bit about this and some of the resources out there. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about the resources, but I'm going to also more talk about that connection piece, because if you have a resource and you can't connect that to a victim, it's really not a worthy resource at that point. It's just a resource that offers this service out here that no one is taking advantage of because we have been unable to make that connection. I don't have a magic wand on a all working plan to connect, but I have a few ideas, and that's what we'll talk about. And these ideas have been things that I've actually done and tried, and sometimes it takes time. We're always in a hurry in our professions and are always trying to get back to the case or whatever, but sometimes you do have to take that time, and it's sometimes in that little bit of time garners the most results. And so let's talk about some of the resources first. Your local senior services. By show of hands, how many of you have a senior services program within your community or your where you work? Almost everybody, it looks like. So senior services, and then the next group, the AAA or the adult, or I'm sorry, the third one, the Adult Area Agency on Aging, kind of work hand in hand. And we'll talk about senior services first. So there's a lot of things that senior services do that you may not know. The local one that I have worked with the most in my community not only provides a place for people to come, it kind of gets them out of that isolation piece where they can have some socialization and interact with other people. Within that very building is the Meals on Wheels place. And so they can come actually get food there, or the Meals on Wheels can be delivered to them. And then there's on-site therapy. One of the things I did prior to this presentation is I have a pretty good solid working relationship with one of the therapists at the senior center, and we talked about this, and I was like, what is the biggest thing that you think cops are missing as far as senior services? And she just said, it's like I said earlier, it's not that they don't know about us, it's that they don't get to know us and get to know how we work and what resources we can offer, so that when they do have that time where they need us, they're not talking to us for the first time. So before I was a detective, I used to I was what they called the elder justice liaison for the police department. And so what I would do is I would go to the senior center quite a bit. And part of it is, especially in uniform, I really enjoyed going in there because a lot of people, especially I'd go through the pool table area and all these elderly gentlemen are playing pool and they would always like, oh, here he comes. He's going to try to hustle us again, you know, and because I would come by there quite often and shoot pool with them and just talk with them and establish that link not only with them, but then also go see the folks there at the senior center and try to get to know them a little more. And I developed relationships with the therapists there, with a lot of the outreach programs that they have there. And now that has come in to really establish a really, really good working relationship with them. One of the things that we did is we made it so that new hires, I feel like this is a little bit of a mislink in the system as we train our new hires on so many different things and they're having to go to this place and that place to know the community a little better. Sometimes they're not even from the community, but a lot of times we forget about the senior services piece of that. And then they get their first elder crime and they don't really know resources, what to add. And so one of the things that department does now is it's kind of a check off on the list for that recruit to be released full duty and go onto their own, like they all want to do so bad and want to get away from that field training officer and be on their own. They have to go spend an hour at the senior center and just, you know, and they have a time with a therapist there. They have time with all the other administrative people and they kind of get to know where that place is. That's really important. The link between the next one is Adult Protective Services. And do we have APS caseworkers here today? Or are we all? Okay, we do. Good. APS varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction on what they do. I think something that, that I know my community and my jurisdiction that I work in sometimes has frustrations, but it's sometimes due to them not knowing the level of what APS works versus what we work. For example, in my state where I work, an at-risk elder crime is a crime that happens against anyone who's 70 years old or older, and it does not matter any kind of vulnerability whatsoever. There does not need, it's just a number. So you have that domestic, and you have a victim who is 71 years old, and their partner is 70 or whatever, and they assault, the police get there. By rule of that at-risk enhancement, it's already a felony just because of the number. It does not require a vulnerability in our state. However, in our state, APS has to have a vulnerability attached with whatever age is in their criteria. And so officers get frustrated with that because they need or want help. And by statute, APS may not have that in their threshold of responsibility. However, I feel like if you, and I tried to do this when I was a detective as well, is get to know your APS caseworkers because they, like you, have a caseload. They really do. And when you start working with them, you'll start to know them individually. Sometimes you'll start breaking down some of those barriers with them. And it's amazing what they can offer. We had a case that I worked with APS on where it was at a another assisted living. This was a neglect case, and we started off with one. The case started off with training that was provided by an ombudsman from the AAA, and they're my next group I'm going to talk about. But that anonymous report that was slipped underneath the door started with one victim of neglect and abuse, and led to 6 others. And that caseworker that I worked with, she and I from APS went. I think we did 13 interviews in one day. We started, you know, as far south as Westminster, and we're all the way up in Fort Collins interviewing caretakers and stuff that witnessed the abuse. Having that adult protective service caseworker was immense for our resource as a police officer, but it was also helping that senior or that elder that had been victimized get the best type of investigation for their case. The next one I've kind of touched on briefly. The AAA. How many people are aware of what the AAA is, or the Area Agency on Aging? Good. We have, I would say, about half, and that's good because I want to, for those that didn't raise your hand, I've heard this before from different people I work with, but the therapist at the senior center said, if the senior center can't help you with a resource, the AAA or the Area Agency on Aging probably can. They kind of have a tandem effect of what some of the services that they provide. If you don't know anything about the AAA was a result of the Older Americans Act in 1973. And basically this act charged this organization to intervene and help elderly people live in independence and in dignity and free from abuse and neglect of what we're trying to do, right? It also includes the Ombudsman program. And if you don't know what the Ombudsman program is they're kind of like an intermediary person that can go into all the facilities and can kind of vouch and act on the rights of that person that lives in that facility. It's an amazing program, and get to know your AAA. If you don't know or know anybody in your area, in your jurisdiction from the Area Agency on Aging, I would strongly recommend that you reach out and connect with them because they can help you. There's just a vast amount of things that they can too. Mental health services. I think about this a lot of times, we do have a mental health crisis in America right now, but it's not just a young person's crisis. It also includes the elderly population, and probably even more so than we know. So if you are in contact with somebody and they're in crisis, don't hesitate to get mental health partners if that's a group in your area or whatever it's called in your area. Try to get that connection going. And again, like I've said in all the other places, sometimes that takes you to take 10, 15 minutes out of your schedule, go to MHP, find out who is the person that you would deal with if you came across that crisis. Get to know a face and a name. That really makes big dividends later on. Veteran services. A lot of our elder people are served, or they are recipients of different services that the VA can offer. I think this is something that we often forget because we don't ask enough questions, but if it doesn't just provide medical treatment, the VA, go on the VA's website and you'll see a whole bunch of other things that they can assist with, and getting that connection made is pretty important. Food assistance, I kind of mentioned that with the Meals on Wheels or whatever your local community offers. Housing assistance, that's another thing right now that is just sometimes next to impossible. I had a case where we had after hours need of placement, and it was a strong need. We had a very neglected person, and we were going to arrest the perpetrators who were the caretakers, and we didn't have a place. It was after hours. We didn't have a place for the victim to go, and she couldn't be home alone. And so as a detective, I was thinking, well, what in the world are we going to do? We can't leave her here. And clearly these people are going to jail for what they did. And so it kind of gave us a quandary of what are we going to do? And sometimes you have to think outside the box on those kind of cases. I called APS. I had the supervisor's cell phone number on my phone because I called her so many times, and we had a good personal relationship. We talked a lot about cases. We did a lot of MDTs together with the Adult Protection Review Team, etc. So we knew each other. So it wasn't the first time we were calling. And I called her and I said, Tanya, what are we going to do with this victim? And she said, well, we don't have after hours placement, immediate, emergency after hours placement. But if she needs to go to the hospital, then I promise that we can do placement in the morning. We'll find some place and deal with it in the morning, but I can't come out now and I don't have anybody to do that. So we had to be creative. And we did a 72-hour hold. The M1 was what we call it back in Colorado. This person was she wasn't a danger to herself other than she couldn't care for herself, but she was gravely disabled because of the neglect, and she couldn't do that. So by authority of the 72-hour hold or the mental health hold, we could put her on a hold. I went straight to the ER and I said, this person does not leave until tomorrow morning, because for those of you that have worked in patrol or put people on hold, sometimes they beat you home before you get home. And so I had to have that conversation. Under no circumstances, APS will be here tomorrow morning, but she has no other place to go and she needs medical oversight. So that worked out.
And I want to jump in on that real quick. One thing I've seen people do in terms of mental health, but this works for elderly patients, especially those with dementia, with competency issues. In Virginia, we started doing mental health advance directives. like you would do for health advance directives. So if someone's diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, when they are competent and they've been adjudicated to be competent, then have them sign like, okay, the next time that I'm a danger to myself or others, like, this is what I want you to do. I'm going to tell you I don't want to go to the hospital, but I want you to take me there. And when I'm there, I want you to jab this needle into me with this medication, right? Because that's been shown to work. And I think that there's probably a place for that if people aren't already doing that in patients with dementia, where when you know that individual can make good decisions and they're competent, you can have them make decisions like, in the event that I cannot care for myself or something like that, like just temporarily, because I might be having good and bad days, like this is just a mental health kind of advanced directive or instructions for my future self. I'm going to flip us ahead to this one because I want to leave time for everyone to have questions.
Okay. So the resources for investigators, this one of the things is I didn't want to leave out our resources. We want to talk about the resources for the at-risk elders or the people that we're dealing with, but we have resources too. The MDTs, every module this morning has talked about MDTs. If you have an adult protection review team or an elder fatality review team or whatever you call it in your area, those are great people to go staff your cases, the tough ones, the ones that may not be criminal in nature, but have something. We need to do something. We can't just leave this and say, well, better luck next time. Hopefully you're not dead the next time we come back. There's no crime here, right? We have to have some of those where we have to make a decision, and sometimes those teams are the ones to do. I mentioned the senior services already, but they're a great asset for you as an investigator as well. Training for investigators involving elder abuse is the last one I'm going to talk about. And I heard Paige put in a prop for this too earlier, and I'm going to do the same thing. Paige and I teach on a national team and there's other people in this room that I've seen that are on the national training team for the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, which is funded by OVW. If you have never had, your community has never had a grant from OVW on elder abuse investigations, go see Janice. It's a great grant, and the result is you have officers at the line level at patrol and investigators that can go to a basic class. It's an 8-hour class, and then they can also go to an investigator class, which is also offered. They have to go through the grant cycle, get the grant. Janice has got information back there at the OVW table. This is something that impacted my career as far as an elder abuse investigator, probably the very most. I was able to go to the TOT, the trainer of the trainers, in Phoenix, and learn the curriculum and start teaching it into my community. We taught in the first 3-year cycle, we taught probably about 400 commissioned police officers on effective elder abuse investigations, the dynamics of elder abuse, all that stuff. And then I actually became a trainer for them, and now I get to travel around and teach grantees. This is something that will impact your community. If you haven't had any of that education piece, it's free money out there that you have to apply for, obviously. But go see Janice. It will make an impact on your community and the investigations that are coming forward.
All right, we'll stop here for a second. Does anybody have any questions for us? Can we answer any questions? Yeah, I don't have the microphone, but I can probably hear you. I'll repeat the question for everyone to hear.
I'm not sure if someone was here from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, but they have a free resource called the Treatment Improvement Protocol 26 that focuses on older adults. And that you can download onto an iPad or any kind of computer, and you can scan it really quickly. And it's a 360 on mental health issues and behavioral health issues, such as substance abuse for older adults.
Okay, so if you want, what does everybody type into Google to get it?
Just put tip 26.
Okay, thank you. So I always need to know what do I type into Google? Yep. That's great. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Lisa Furr, and I just wanted to put a plug in. Chris is right. The Abuse and Later Life grant can make changes in your community. I also want to put a plug in for the OVC grant for multidisciplinary teams. So if you're looking to do that case review work and looking to hire a coordinator, get someone to do your competency evaluations and site consults, and to get a forensic accountant in your community to assist you in your teams, the OVC grant can do that. It's a wonderful opportunity for you to take this work one step further. And Stacy was in here. She might be out at the table. Talk to her about that. Talk to any of the TA advisors or any of the people wearing the MDT stuff, and we'll be happy to tell you about that grant and the work that it can do in those communities.
Yeah, and you can't overstate like how nice it is to have like so many problems in this arena and in other arenas could be solved so easily by finding the right person with the right bit of knowledge, right? And you think about how long it took you to get your skill set and your knowledgeability, and then when somebody will tell me something and I'll be like, wait, that's fascinating. I didn't know that thing. You can do that, and they're like, how do you not know that? Like, what about me would make you think that I would know that, right? Like, and so like it really does take all. It just takes all kinds. You're going to need a team of people. Yeah. All right. If not, we had a list of resources that are on there on the sheet. I have a list of academic resources. If you're interested in like the post trauma reaction of victims and memory and that stuff, I highly suggest you look at Rebecca Campbell out of Michigan State. She's the one like leading the charge and all of that research, and she is absolutely fantastic. And that's a set of information for law enforcement officers, but when you look and you read it, you'll honestly feel like, I wish somebody would have told me this a long time ago. All right, so with that, we'll vacate the stage then and get ready for the next presenter.